one of the books you wrote, the most recent one called False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. Good title, by the way. Very intense. Makes me want to read it. What is likely the worst effect of climate change?
First, let me just, my editor actually hated the subtitle because it gives away the whole book. It basically tells you what the book tries to make. I think, that's exactly what it should be. It's about getting this conversation out in the public sphere. So the worst thing that climate change can do is like the worst thing that anything can do is that it wipes out everything and we all die. So it's not like, if you just go looking for worst case outcomes, anything can get to the worst case outcome. Imagine if we suggest what's the worst thing that could happen from HIV? It breaks down one or more African states because we don't fix it, and then you get sort of biological warfare and terrorism. Throw in that in the mix, and then you get someone who makes a virus and kills the whole world. You can make worst case scenarios for everything.
But let's just hold on. So, I get the point, and sorry for the interruption. And I appreciate worst case analysis because I am fundamentally a computer scientist, and that was the thing that defined the discipline of to measure the quality of the algorithm. You measure what is its worst case performance. That's the big O notation. That's how you discuss algorithms. What is the worst possible thing in terms of performance this thing can do? But for climate change, let's even go crazy. What is exactly the worst case scenario for climate change? Because I have to be honest and say I haven't really paid deep attention. I just have a lot of colleagues who think about climate and so on. And there's a kind of, in the alarmism, there was a sense, this is a very serious problem. Yeah. And then the sentence would never finish. Yeah. What exactly is the problem? Well, the extinction of the human species, okay. With a virus, I understand how that can possibly happen. What is the mechanism by which the human species becomes extinct because of climate change?
I'm not sure I would want to be able to argue that because it really requires you to have sort of very, very extreme parameter choices all down the line. And so it's more, it's this kind of idea that we hit some of these unexpected outcomes. So for instance, the West Antarctic ice sheet melts really, really quickly. It doesn't look like that can happen really, really quickly, but let's just say that this could happen within 100 years or something. So we basically get 7 meters, 20 feet of sea level rise. That will be a real challenge to a lot of places around the world. This would have, significant costs. It's likely, and there's actually been a study that's tried to estimate, could we deal with that? And the short answer is yes, if you're fairly well off. If you're Holland, you can definitely deal with it. It's also likely that most developing countries are going to be much closer to Holland towards the end of the century because they'll be much richer. So they can probably handle it, but it will be a real challenge.
May I ask a dumb question?
Yeah.
What happens when the sea level rises exactly? What is the painful aspect of that?
It is that all of your current infrastructure in a lot of coastal cities around the world that are literally built on, Jakarta is a good example, that are literally built on the inches above the sea level. If you then get a sea level rise, they'll rise, say, 20 feet? That would be like a third or a fourth of a foot every year.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
I see no evidence that that's even.
But hold on a second. We're not talking about evidence.
No,
we're talking about worst case analysis and algorithm.
And so basically, you would see your infrastructure, all your stuff, very quickly being very, very challenged, and you'd basically have to put up huge seawalls or migrate out of that area
very quickly.
Well, very quickly as in 50 years or something.
Right. So is that as a human species, we're not able to respond to that kind of thing?
Of course we are. And look, again, the point here is then there's a lot of other arguments. And I should just, put the disclaimer, this is not what I think is correct. But, you're asking me what's the worst case outcome that you have. So most of global warming is really about that we we're used to one way of doing things. So, we live in Jakarta because it's right next to the sea. We're used to the sea being at this level. We grow our crops because we're used to, you grow corn here, you grow wheat here because we're used to that's where the precipitation and the temperature is the right for this kind of crop. If this changes, and this is the same thing with houses. If it gets colder, if it gets warmer, it's suddenly uncomfortable because you've built your house wrong. Yeah. So our infrastructure will be wrong if the world changes, and that's what climate change does.
At a large scale.
Yes. And so this is a problem in most of these sentences. But if you then sort of take it to the extreme and say, well, imagine that you're going to get a huge sea level rise. Imagine that you're going to get a very different sort of precipitation. For instance, the rain monsoon in the Indian subcontinent changes dramatically. That could affect a lot of agriculture and make it really hard to imagine that you could feed India well. There are these kinds of things where you can imagine, and then that this would be very difficult to deal with. And then if you add all of it up, you could possibly get sort of a system collapse because, you just have too many problems in one.
Is it possible to model those kinds of things? So what I understand is the sea level rise itself isn't the destructive thing. It's the fact that it creates migration patterns and human tension, battle over resources. And so you start to get these human things, human conflict. So the big negative impact won't be necessarily from the fact that you have to move your house. It's the fact that once you move your house, that means something else down the line. And it's the secondary, tertiary effects that can have potentially to wars, military conflict, can have destabilize entire economies, all that kind of stuff, because of the migration pattern. Is it possible to model those kinds of things?
So there are people who looked at this and surprisingly, again, most people will move within their country for a lot of different reasons, but, mainly language and political structure. You have your money, you have your relationships there. So it's not like we're going to see these big moves, from southern Mexico and Central America up to the U.S. or from Africa up to the EU. That's not predominantly because of climate. That's because there's a lot of, welfare opportunity. You can make your life much, much better. You can become much more productive if you move into a richer country. So yes, there are these issues. Again, you're asking me for sort of what is it that could really sort of break down the world. I think the fundamental point is to recognize that it's not like we haven't dealt with huge challenges in the past. And we've dealt with them really well. So just one fun thing, I encourage everyone to just look that up on Wikipedia, the rising of Chicago. So in the 1850s, Chicago was a terribly dirty place, and they didn't have good sewers. And so they decided, and we can't really make up our mind, they decided to raise Chicago 1 to 2 feet. And so they simply took one block at a time. They put like 50,000 jacks underneath a building, and they would just raise the building. And then they'd go on to the next building. They raised all of Chicago 1 or 2 feet. This is, almost 200 years ago. Of course, we will be able to deal with these things. I'm not saying it'll be fun or that it'll be cheap. Of course, we would rather not have to deal with this. But we're a very inventive species. And so it's very unlikely that we'll not be able to deal with these issues.
COVID pandemic just said, hold my beer. The response of human civilization to the COVID pandemic seems to have not, they didn't find the carjacks.
Yeah.
It seems to have not been as effective as I would have hoped for as a human that believes in the basic competence of leadership and all that kind of stuff. It seems that given the COVID pandemic, luckily did not turn out to be a pandemic that would eradicate most of the human species, which is something you always have to consider and worry about. That I would have hoped we would have less economic impact and we would respond more effectively and in terms of policy, in terms of socially, medically, all that kind of stuff. So if the COVID pandemic brought the world to its knees, then what does a sea level rise?
So I think there's a different kind of thing that happened in the COVID. So politicians, and a lot of politicians, I think, made certainly suboptimal decisions, but I also find the fact that we actually managed to get a vaccine in a year. We should not be, sort of unaware of the fact that, yes, we did a lot of stupid stuff and a lot of people were really, really annoyed, but fundamentally we fixed this. We could have done it better and prettier. I mean, I rode through the COVID pandemic in southern Sweden. Yes, we can have that whole conversation. It was certainly much easier to live there than many other places. But the fundamental point was we actually fixed it. So yes, we'll do that with climate. We'll make a lot of bad decisions and we'll waste a lot of money, like we do with all other problems. But are we going to fix this? Yeah.
Can you add on to that uncomfortable discussion of what's the worst thing that could possibly happen?
I'm not worried about the sea level rise component. Certainly not nearly as much as the heat and disruption of agriculture patterns and water supplies. And a lot of it relates to, again, path dependency in history. Farmers are the heroes of humanity all through history because they're incredibly adaptable. If you give them access to resources, in some cases, it's just crop insurance, which is really basically still impossible to get in big chunks of Africa to get you through those hard spots. But the heat issue is the one that's the most basic element related to global warming from CO2 buildup is hotter heat waves. There's still some lack of evidence of the intensification, but the duration and that's really matters for heat is how many days seems to be very powerfully linked to global warming. And so how many people die as a result of that is important.
So we're talking about, maybe you can also educate me, what's the average projection for the next 100 years of the temperature rise? Is it 2 degrees Celsius?
Well, yeah, although this gets us into the modeling realm. You're assuming, you have to assume different emissions possibilities. You have to assume we still don't know the basic physics, like how many clouds form in a warming climate and how that relates to limiting warming. There are aspects of the fundamental warming question that are still deeply uncertain.
But the debate is like 2, 3, or 4 Celsius.
It's in that range.
But the thing is, all of those are bad for, this is an educational question.
Sure.
It doesn't seem like that much from a weather perspective if you just turn up the AC and so on in your own personal home. But it is, from a global perspective, a huge impact on agriculture.
Well, yeah, and getting back to sea level and glaciers, the melting point of ice is a number.
Yeah.
And so if you pass that number, things start to change. What became known about Antarctica and Greenland more is that its ocean temperature, the seawater in and around and under these ice sheets, because it kind of gets under parts of Antarctica, is what's driving the dynamics that could lead to more abrupt change, more than air temperature. Glaciers, these big ice sheets, live or die based on how much snow falls and how much ice leaves every year. And I was up on the Greenland ice sheet in 2004, and I've written about it forever since then. You know, it's the same amount of water that's in the Gulf of Mexico, as if, you know, God or some great force came down and flash flows the Gulf of Mexico and plunked it up on land. That's the ice sheet. It's a lot of water. That's 23 feet of sea level rise. But you were not going to melt it all. And the pace at which that erosion begins and becomes sort of a runaway train is still not well understood. That change from like a manageable level of sea level rise from these ice sheets to something that becomes truly unstoppable, or that has these discontinuities where you get a lot more all of a sudden, to me, it's in the realm of what I've taken to calling known unknowables. Like, don't count on another IPCC report magically including science that says, aha, now we know it's going to be 5 feet by 2100. Because learning, there's a lot of negative learning in science. This may be true in your body of science too. There's a guy named Jeremy Bassis, Bassis, who wrote a paper about this West Atlantic, the idea that you could get this sudden cliff breakdown of these ice shelves around Antarctica leading to rapid sea level rise. He did more modeling in physics, and it turns out that you end up with, it's a much more progressive and self-limiting phenomenon. But those papers don't get any attention in the media because
they're not scary.
They're not scary, and they're sort of after the fact. Just this past year, there's been this cycle around collapse, the word collapse, and Antarctic ice. It started actually several years ago with the idea that the West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly vulnerable. And some paper, the science community, like the birds we were talking about, flocks to it, and some high-profile papers are written. And then a deeper inquiry reveals, it's more complicated than that. And we, the journalists, the media, pundits, don't pay attention to that stuff. So and actually, which is why I've started to develop kind of a dictionary. I call it watchwords, like words to, if you're out there, you're just a you're a person and you want to know what's really going on. You hear these words like collapse in the context of ice. What do you do with that? And so I've created conversations around these words. Geologists and ice scientists use the word collapse. They're talking about a centuries-long process. They're not talking about the World Trade Center. And scientists would do well to be more careful with words like that. Unless your focus is what we were saying earlier, your idea that alarming people will spur them to act, then you use that word carelessly.
Can I just follow up on the other point that you said? 2, 3, 4 degrees. That doesn't sound like much. I can just crank up the air conditioning. I think that sort of touches on a really, really important point. That for most rich people, much of climate change is not really going to be all that impactful. It still will have an impact, but fundamentally, if you're well off, you can mitigate a lot of these impacts.
And there's a young scientist at Carnegie Mellon, Destiny Knock. She just was the lead author on a study, what poor and prosperous households do in a heat wave when they have access to air conditioning. In a poor household, you wait, they found through science, they delay turning on the air conditioner 4 to 7 degrees more of heating before they start to use the air conditioner. And that create adverse outcomes. If you have an asthmatic in the house, an old person, you're endangering their lives. And that's just a little tiny microscopic fractal example of this powerful, real phenomenon that there's a divide in vulnerability. And it's not just based on where you live. This is families in like Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about, Botswana. And so that divide in capacity to deal with environmental stress is something you can really work on. And it gets hidden in all this talk of climate crisis. People
and that's one of the important parts is both to say, look, if 8 billion people will now have all experienced this, even though for each one of them it's manageable, it's still a big problem because it's 8 billion people living through this.
And the second air condition 8 billion.
Yes, and then it's the point of getting to realize it's very, very much about how do you help the world's poor. And that's very much about making it more affordable, basically getting them out of poverty. And remember, getting out of poverty doesn't just mean that they can now afford to air condition themselves, but they get better education, they get better opportunities, they get better lives in so many other ways. And then at the end of it's not just about making sure that we focus on this one problem, but it's recognizing that these families and have lots of different issues that they would like us to focus on, climate and heat waves just being one of them. So it's sort of taking progressive steps back and realizing, all right, okay, this is a problem, not the end of the world.
And one tiny little last example, you mentioned Jakarta at the beginning. It's really valuable to look around the world at places that are sort of leading indicator places, whether it's sea level rise or heat. And you could do that. Jakarta is sinking like a foot a year, literally a foot a year. It's some insane number from withdrawing groundwater, from gas withdrawal it's a delta, it's sediment, it's built on sediment. I wrote a piece ages ago at the New York Times calling it Delta Blues, I'm a musician. Mm-hmm. And in Jakarta, so what are they doing? They're moving the capital to another area. So that says to me, there's a lot of plasticity too. It's a city that's going through that rate of sea level, of their relationship with the sea level through sinking is way faster than what's happening with global warming. So look to those kinds of places, and you can start to build.
Tokyo
where you
had the same thing in the 1930s. They were also withdrawing lots of water way too fast, and so one of the obvious things is maybe you should stop withdrawing water so fast. And again, we seem to almost be intent on finding the most politically correct way to fix a problem, or the thing that sort of gets the most clicks, instead of the thing that actually works the best. So a lot of these things are really not rocket science solutions.